There were very few people on the street, so I was surprised when I saw a line of people pressed against a building up ahead. I was just about to reach into my pocket and pull out a slip of paper that had the address written on it when it suddenly connected in my head. This was probably the place. As I got closer, I saw a sign on the building, The Club. The lettering was in bright paint, orange paint crudely done and peeling away. The men in line, and I noticed that it was all men, were huddled together like they were shielding each other from the wind and the cold. They stood unmoving, as silent as statues. As I walked by, I became aware that not a single person reacted to my passing. Nobody said anything or even looked over. Their eyes were locked on the ground, staring at their feet. Nobody was making any eye contact with anybody else. With them not looking at me, I felt free to look at them. They were dressed in a shoddy assortment of coats and hats and scarves and boots and shoes. Nothing seemed to match anything. It was obvious that some of the men had on layers and layers of clothing. They looked puffy. A couple weren't really even that badly dressed, while some others looked as if they were clothed completely in rags, held together in defiance of gravity and sanity. I stopped in front of a door that marked the start of the line. Should I wait or just go inside? I thought about it for a second. There was no way I was waiting out here with these people. Slowly and hesitantly, I walked to the door and gave a little push. It opened, and I peeked inside. The room was dominated by 8 or 10 long wooden tables, each flanked by benches. There wasn't a soul in sight. Through the door, it was warm, and there was a distinct smell of cooking. I wasn't sure what it was, but it didn't smell half bad. A man wearing an apron and carrying a big pot came into the room through a swinging door at the far end of the hall. "Excuse me," I called out. "It's almost ready. Just wait outside." He looked up and saw me. "I'm not here to eat," I explained. "I'm here to see Mr. MacDonald." "I'm MacDonald." I walked over toward him. "I'm Ian Blackburn." I held out my hand to shake. He just stared at me, looking me up and down. I suddenly felt even more nervous and unsure of myself. He turned away and put the pot down on the counter, alongside another big pot. Both were steaming hot. That's where the smell was coming from. "So why are you here?" he asked, sounding suspicious. I lowered my hand. "I'm here to apply for a position." He laughed. It was a thick, heavy, throaty laugh that forced its way out. "The only position we have is upright, standing right here behind the counter, shoveling out food." "That's what I'm here for, to be interviewed to do that as a volunteer." "Volunteers we have, interviews we don't. You showed up, so you get to work." I felt relieved. Being late hadn't cost me the job. He reached down and grabbed something off the counter and tossed it to me. I unraveled it as to reveal a balled-up apron. It was grayish and stained. "Put it on and then slip on some gloves." I started to take off my coat. "Better leave that on. I ain't got no time to lock it up in the back. If you lay it down, somebody might steal it. Best not to lay anything down around here. You don't want to walk. Some people might try to rip you off for a nice coat like that." It wasn't much of a stretch for me to believe him. For a split second I thought of telling him what had happened, and then stopped myself. I just felt embarrassed and stupid about the whole thing. I should have seen it coming. I took a better look at him. He was a strange-looking old bird. He was shorter than me, but stocky. Looked like he could take care of himself. Actually, judging from the way his nose was all bent out of shape, I was certain he'd been in more than a few fights in his time. I tried to figure out his age. His hair was gray and thin. His face was lined and weather-beaten. He had to be in his 60s, if not older. I slipped the apron on over my, looped the strings around my waist, and tied them up. "What did you say your name was again?" he asked Ian. "Well, Ian, I'll explain what you have to do. It's particularly complicated. Each man grabs one of those," he said, pointing to a pile of brown trays. "He puts a bowl and a plate and a plastic cup on it, and then moves over here, where you give him 2 scoops of food in the bowl, 1 slice of bread, then pour him a drink. Think you can handle that?" "I think so. Some of the guys might ask you to give them more. Just tell them that they only get 1 serving. After everybody has eaten, if there's any left, then they can come back for seconds. Most of the fellows are regulars and know the rules, but some of them like to test anybody new." "Okay, no problem, Mr. MacDonald. Call me Mac." "Sure, Mac." "So is this just a one-night thing, or are you supposed to be here for a while?" he asked. 40 hours. "Is this like a court-ordered thing?" Mac asked. "Court-ordered? What do you mean? You got convicted of something and were sentenced to do this instead of going to jail and paying a fine?" "No," I exclaimed. "It's for school." Did he think I looked like some sort of a criminal? "What sort of school?" As he was wiping the counter and stirring the pot. My civics class. We have to do volunteer work to pass, I explained. So you have to be here. If I want to pass civics, this really isn't something you want to do, he said. Guess not, I answered reluctantly, thinking that maybe I shouldn't have admitted that. You're not hoping to grow up to be like a social worker or something like that, are you? He asked. He sounded suspicious. I laughed just about the last thing in the world I wanted to become. The truth was, there actually had been a time I toyed with that idea. Then my father told me how difficult the job was and how badly it paid. Even better, some of these do-gooders who come around here to do volunteer work think they're here to save the souls or do therapy instead of serving food. He paused and stared at me. You're not here to judge them or save them, just serve them some food. I'm not trying to save everybody except myself from a failing mark, I said. I'm just trying to do my hours so I can pass. Good, this ain't no social project. Understand? He wiped his hands on his dishcloth tucked into his belt. You don't have to worry about me. I'm going to keep my mouth shut, serve food, do my hours, and leave. He laughed again. Sounds like you have a lot in common with the people here. What do you mean? I asked. None of them want to be here either, and you're smart to keep your mouth closed. Worst thing you could do is ask a lot of questions. That sometimes leads to people getting upset. I'm not here to ask anybody anything, I said. I won't even talk to anybody if you don't want me to. Talking is fine, just don't be giving out any crap. I don't give crap, unless somebody tries to give it to me first, I thought, but didn't say. Just be polite and respectful. Don't go asking a whole lot of questions. Something you think might be innocent, just sort of make conversation. Like, where do you live? Might set somebody off, especially somebody who's paranoid. And almost everybody who walks through those doors is at least a little paranoid. Everybody, I asked? You have to be at least a little paranoid if you want to survive living on the streets. There really are people out there who want to rip you off or hurt you. That's just the way of the streets. Just remember, because somebody's paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get them. He chuckled to himself. I think it's time to let them in. I watched as he walked over to the door and opened it up. Come on in, boys. Supper's waiting, he called out. The first two men shuffled in and the line snaked in behind them. Max stood by the door, welcoming people, shaking hands, patting people in the back. He gave one old man, all bent over and dressed in absolute filthy clothing, a hug. I shuddered, wondering what sort of diseases and bugs the old man was carrying. My scalp got all itchy just thinking about it. As soon as I got home, I was going to take one very long hot shower. The first man stood in front of me, tray in hand. He was wearing a big, bulky parka, a thick sweater, and a scarf wrapped around his neck, the standard toque on his head. He didn't look very old, maybe in his late 20s. Across the counter and through the steam and food smell rising from the pots, I could still make out the distinct odor of alcohol coming from him. What are you serving? He asked. I didn't know. I lifted up the lid and peered in through the rising steam. It looks like some kind of a stew. I stirred it around with a big ladle, lifted a scoop. Beef stew. Mac makes great stew. Ever try it? No, I exclaimed. Did you really think that I was going to eat food from a soup kitchen? It's my first time here, I said, trying to cover up my feelings of disgust. If there's any left at the end, you should try it, he said. If there's any left, I will, I said, although I was just saying that to humor him. I picked up the big ladle and dipped it in again. I carefully put some of the stew in the bowl and on the tray. It actually did smell good. I repeated the process, and the second scoop filled to the brim. The man reached out and grabbed a bun. Thanks, he said. You're welcome. I hope it's good. Guaranteed to be the best thing I eat today, he said, and then chuckled. Guaranteed to be the only thing I eat today. I'm sorry, I stammered. Not your fault, he said, and shrugged. Maybe you could take another bun or he shook his head. Can't do that. Might be taking the last bun away from somebody who gets nothing. Maybe at the end when you get some stew, I'll get an extra bun. Sure, okay. This really hadn't been what I expected. This guy hadn't eaten today, and he was worried about somebody at the back of the line. He probably didn't even know. That wasn't how I was expecting to see a street person be. You two through gabbing, barked the man behind him. There are people here who need some grub, you know. I startled and then quickly dipped the ladle into the pot. I fished out a heaping helping, and as I dropped it into the bowl, it slopped onto the tray. Be careful, he barked. Don't go wasting my food. Sorry, it was an accident. He was older and grizzled, and there was more than just a slight odor of alcohol coming off him. He seemed to be swaying back and forth ever so gently, and as I carefully put a second scoop into his bowl, I saw that the tray was shaking. You can take a bun, I said. You think I don't know the routine, he snapped. I've been coming here longer than you've been alive, you little... Leave him alone, you old buzzard, snapped the first man I'd served. You want a piece of me, challenged the old man. You hassle me and I'll cut you. Take your food and shut up and sit down. It was Mac. You say another word and you'll be banned for weeks. The old man opened his mouth to answer, revealing a mess of yellowed missing teeth. He mumbled something under his breath, but turned and walked away, sitting down at the table with his back to us. Don't worry about it, Max said. You didn't do nothing wrong. Just keep serving. I dipped the ladle back onto the pot and served out food to the next man in line, and then the next, and then the next. It was funny. Every one of them was the same but different. Some were polite, others rude. Some were like zombies, hardly noticing that I'd given them food until they were prodded by the person behind them to keep moving. There were those who were cursing under their breath or muttering away, talking to people. I couldn't see or hear or answer back. Some were angry, others seemed cheerful, even happy. Maybe they're the craziest of the bunch. Wouldn't you have to be crazy to be happy eating at a soup kitchen and living on the street? There were some who didn't seem that much older than me, others who must have been in their 70s, and a whole bunch of whose ages I couldn't discern behind the layers of grime, beard, and clothing. They could have been 27 or 72. Interestingly, there wasn't a woman in the group. Where did the shopping cart ladies go to eat? Was there another soup kitchen for women? I got to the bottom of the first pot. I was just going to put it aside when I looked back at the line. It was at least as long as when I'd started serving. What would happen if there wasn't enough food for the last few in line? I wasn't so worried about them going hungry as how they might react. How might they react to me if they didn't get fed? What was that saying I'd heard about delivering bad news? Kill the messenger? That was it. I'd be the guy to tell them there was no more food. That old man had mentioned cutting somebody, and if the man in the park was to be believed, everybody in here had some sort of weapon. That is, everybody in here but me. I tipped the pot and scraped the stew off the side, accumulating until there was a full ladle to dish out. That's the way to do it, Max said. He had returned from the kitchen carrying more buns. I put the now completely empty pot off to the side and dragged forward the second pot. I took off the lid. The stew was still steamy hot. Maybe I was hungrier than I thought, because it did smell good to me. I dipped in the ladle and added a second scoop to the bowl of the man patiently waiting. He smiled and nodded his head in thanks. I caught a quick glimpse of my watch. I'd been here less than 40 minutes. It seemed like hours already. Do we have enough? I asked Mac, motioning toward the back of the line. I think we'll be okay. Hopefully enough that we get a bowl too. You already eaten? Mac asked. I grabbed something before I left home, I answered. That something was a granola bar and a couple of cookies. I didn't care how good the stew smelled or how hungry I was. There was no way I'm going to eat here. You're lying to me, Mac asked. What? You lying about eating? No, of course not, I lied. Just want to make sure. Didn't want you to lie so you wouldn't be taking food away from some of our clients. We won't be taking food from somebody. We'll only eat once everybody has had their fill. It's just that I'm not hungry, honestly. How can you not be hungry for a bowl of this? Mac asked in all seriousness. It's my own recipe, made from only the finest ingredients. Where do you get all this food from? I asked, trying to change the subject. Some I have to buy, but a whole lot of it comes from Second Harvest. What's that? I asked as I continued to serve the people. It's an organization that picks up foods from stores and restaurants that have extra. It's all perfectly good food that would go to waste if it wasn't collected and put to good use. The meat for our stew today is cut up steak from Centros. Centros? You know what? He asked. Who doesn't? Centros is one of the classiest, most expensive restaurants in town. Never been there myself, but that's what I hear. I'd been there half a dozen times with my parents. I thought it was best not to mention that. But why would you give away food? Sometimes they order too much, or there's a problem with the freezer, or the chef doesn't think it's tender enough. Maybe they just want to do something good. Anyway, you cut it, they get a charitable donation receipt, and we get to feed some people who really need to be fed. Just then there was a commotion over the counter. Two men sitting across from each other at a table had jumped to their feet and were yelling and swearing at each other. It looked like it was going to evolve into a full-fledged fist fight. Excuse me, Max said. He reached by me under the counter and pulled out a big baseball bat. I backed away. Mac moved around the corner and quickly got close to where the two men were screaming at each other. What was he going to do with that bat? Without warning, he smashed the bat down on the table between the two men, causing cups to overrun and bowls and cutlery to jump along the whole length of the table. "Both of you, sit down or get out," he yelled at the top of his lungs. The whole room had gone completely silent. Everybody had stopped eating or talking. They all stared at Mac holding the bat. Both men dropped back down to their seats without saying another word. "How you act on the street is your business," Mac said sternly. "How you act in here is mine. I don't know what you were fighting about, but I want you both to forget it. Shake hands and be friends." I expected them to argue or get up and leave. Instead, they just held out their hands and shook. "That's better," Max said. "We'll have no more of this, from anybody." He looked around the room and holding the bat up. "Isn't life tough enough for us already? Aren't there enough people out there trying to harm and abuse you without doing it to each other?" A couple of men called out in agreement, and others nodded. Mac walked over, circled the counter, and put the bat away underneath it. The regular sounds of the room, talking, laughing, clinking of cutlery and bowls and glasses, all started up again. It was like the whole thing had never taken place. "Does that happen very often?" I asked. "Too often for my liking, but not as much as in the past. I'm known to run a pretty strict place here. Those who aren't going to follow the rules know better than to come here." "If they don't come here, where do they go instead?" I asked, hoping to avoid that place completely. "This isn't the only location in town offering a meal. Of course, some people have been banned from some places, and others won't ever come to soup kitchens to begin with." "What do they do instead?" "Eat out of dumpsters, hang around the streets or the park, just over from here, begging for change." He paused. "That park is one bad place." Again, I was tempted to say something, but I held my tongue. I didn't know why I cared what he thought, but I did. Maybe it was nothing more than me not wanting him to think I was an idiot or a wimp. I just kept ladling the food out. If we did run out of food, at least I knew where the baseball bat was now.